Did you ever think your final exams were a nightmare? What if they literally determined your entire future with no second chances? What if your grades were decided by a public showdown in front of everyone who mattered, from the 12th to the 15th centuries? Number 9. The Preaching Trial. Theology's final test. Imagine a student, pale from countless nights spent hunched over heavy manuscripts, now standing before a tribunal of stern-faced masters. This was the scene for a theology student embarking on their final examination, particularly for those aiming for the revered Master of Theology degree. Their ultimate trial often involved delivering a full sermon, not to an adoring congregation, but to the most critical audience imaginable. Their future peers and professors, the air in the lecture hall was still heavy with anticipation. Sunlight, filtering through tall, narrow windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the cold rays. The student, perhaps a man named Thomas, adjusted his rough wool tunic, his heart thumping against his ribs. He had spent years, often 7 or more, studying the Bible, the Church Fathers, the voluminous sentences of Peter Lombard, and countless theological commentaries. Now all that knowledge had to condense into a coherent, persuasive, and impeccably orthodox sermon. Thomas began to speak. His voice initially a little shaky, then gaining strength as he delved into his chosen text. He had to explain the scripture, apply its meaning to contemporary life, and uphold the doctrines of the church. Every word was chosen with immense care. His arguments had to be flawless, his logic unassailable. He cited St. Augustine, Gregory the Great, and Dionysius the Areopagite, weaving their wisdom into his own discourse. The masters, seated on their high-backed chairs, listened intently, their faces unreadable. Some made small notes on wax tablets with styluses. When the sermon concluded, a moment of silence stretched thick with unspoken judgment. Then the grilling began. Master John, a formidable theologian known for his sharp intellect, raised a hand. "Brother Thomas," he began, his voice calm but piercing, "you mentioned the nature of grace. Can you elaborate on how your interpretation aligns with the decree of the Fourth Lateran Council, specifically regarding predestination?" Thomas had to think on his feet, recalling obscure canons and the nuanced debates of centuries past. He had to defend his theological position, not just by repeating what he had learned, but by demonstrating a deep understanding and the ability to reconcile potential contradictions. Another master, Master Robert, questioned his choice of an allegorical interpretation for a particular passage. "Is not a literal understanding more appropriate here, Brother Thomas? Are you not straying into dangerous territory with such a reading?" Questions came rapid fire, designed to probe every weakness, every potential misstep. They challenged his scriptural justifications, his understanding of dogmatic theology, his ability to apply moral principles. He had to justify his exegetical choices, his understanding of the sacraments, his arguments concerning sin and salvation. The pressure was immense. A single theological error, a moment of confusion, or a failure to adequately defend a point could mean outright failure. This was not just an academic exercise, it was a demonstration of a man's fitness to interpret God's Word and guide souls. The University of Paris, a renowned center for theology, was especially known for the rigor of these examinations. A master of theology from Paris held immense prestige, a testament to the brutal trials overcome. Thomas spoke for what felt like hours, his mind racing, his voice growing hoarse. Each correct answer brought a tiny flicker of relief, but the next question was always waiting poised to strike. His future as a scholar, a teacher, a priest, or even a bishop hinged on his performance in this one agonizing display of faith and intellect. Number 8. The endurance test of time. Weeks of relentless pressure. Medieval university examinations were not a single event, a one-and-done test that students could prepare for and then forget. They were a protracted multi-stage ordeal, a relentless gauntlet that stretched over weeks, months, and sometimes even years of a student's academic journey. Path from student to bachelor and then to master was a series of escalating challenges, each one more grueling than the last. This meant the pressure was not just concentrated on one day, but was a constant nagging presence for extended periods. Consider the journey of a student at Oxford or Bologna entering the Faculty of Arts. Their path to a bachelor's degree already involved preliminary examinations, often called resmonsions, after a few years of study. These were themselves daunting. Usually private disputations with a master, but even passing those was just the beginning. The student then progressed to the higher degrees, facing further, more intense examinations like the Vespers and the licentiate exams. Each stage demanded not just intellectual readiness, but incredible physical and mental stamina. A student might spend years simply preparing for the responsions, honing their logical skills and memorizing texts. After passing, they would then prepare for the Vespers, which was often a grand public disputation held in the evening before the final licentiate. This alone involved weeks of preparation to defend a series of complex theses against all comers. The actual disputation could last for hours, sometimes extending into the late night, testing a student's ability to debate under extreme duress. Following Vespers, the student would face the licentiate examination, the ultimate trial for the master's degree. This was typically another oral examination, often conducted by a panel of examiners, and it could last for an entire day, or even be broken into multiple sessions across several days. The sheer length of these examinations meant students faced incredible physical tolls. They sat for hours, often without food or drink, their minds racing, their bodies growing weary. Constant anxiety, the lack of restful sleep, and the sheer intellectual exertion pushed students to their absolute limits. Cumulative effect of these prolonged examination periods was immense. Students lived under a perpetual cloud of apprehension. A failure at any stage meant not just repeating the exam, but potentially delaying their degree for months or even years, or abandoning their studies altogether. Their careers, their reputations, and often their families' hopes rested on enduring this relentless intellectual marathon. The pressure was not episodic. It was a continuous state of being, a prolonged test of mental fortitude that few modern students could truly comprehend. The medieval university system was designed not just to test knowledge, but to forge character through an extended, arduous process of intellectual combat. Number 7. The Cogniti Crucible. Instant interpretation of ancient texts. One of the most terrifying challenges in medieval university examinations involved the commentary crucible. Students were not just expected to understand the material they had studied. They were required to demonstrate a deep, nuanced, and spontaneous understanding of complex ancient texts. This often meant being handed a difficult passage from a foundational work, perhaps Aristotle, a church father, or a legal code, and being expected to interpret and comment on it immediately, without any prior preparation or notes. Picture this scene. A student, let us call him William, stood before his masters, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He was aspiring to his bachelor's degree in arts at the University of Bologna. Master Peter, a stern-faced scholar known for his uncompromising standards, held a heavy, leather-bound volume, perhaps a copy of Justinian's Digest. With a precise, almost surgical gesture, Master Peter pointed to a random passage on a page. Brother William, he intoned, his voice flat, comment upon this section, explain its meaning, its context, and its implications. William leaned forward, trying to discern the faded Latin script. His mind raced as he quickly read the lines. This particular passage was from Roman law dealing with obscure property rights and ancient legal precedents. There was no time to prepare, no opportunity to consult notes or quietly ponder. His entire understanding of jurisprudence, the meticulous lectures he had attended, and the countless hours spent poring over his own copies of legal texts had to coalesce into an immediate, articulate response. He began to speak, translating the Latin in his mind, explaining the legal terms and connecting the passage to broader principles of justice and equity. He had to explain why this particular law was enacted, what problem it solved, and how it related to other parts of the sprawling legal code. He had to discuss different interpretations, perhaps citing the opinions of famous glossators like Accursius or Irnerius. The masters listened, their eyes fixed on him, scrutinizing every word, every phrase. They watched for hesitation, for a lack of precision, for any sign that his understanding was superficial. A scribe sat nearby, quill poised, meticulously recording William's every utterance. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by William's voice and the faint scratching of the quill. The pressure was immense. Misinterpreting a single word could lead to a cascading failure of logic. Misunderstanding the historical context could invalidate his entire commentary. This was not a test of memorization, though vast memory was certainly needed. This was a test of analytical skill, critical thinking, and the ability to synthesize complex information on the spot. Failure meant public embarrassment and a significant delay in his academic progress. Success, however, meant demonstrating a truly profound grasp of the subject matter, a capability that few individuals possessed. Crucible ensured that only those with a deep intuitive command of their discipline could advance, weeding out any who merely scratched the surface of knowledge. Number 6. The Latin Labyrinth. Navigating a world in a dead language. For medieval university students, the entire academic universe existed within the confines of a language that was not their native tongue. Latin was not just the language of scholarship. It was the language of instruction, discussion, and examination. From the moment a student entered the lecture hall until they graduated, they were immersed in a Latin labyrinth, where complete fluency was not merely a desirable skill, but an absolute necessity for survival and success. Imagine a student named Julian, fresh from a small village, arriving at the bustling University of Paris. His initial weeks were a cacophony of unfamiliar sounds, as masters lectured for hours, their voices echoing through cold stone halls, every single word spoken in Latin. Fellow students conversed, argued, and even joked in Latin. This was not just about understanding the lectures. It was about living and breathing Latin. When examination time arrived, this linguistic immersion became the ultimate test. There were no multiple-choice questions or essays written in the vernacular. Every response, every argument, every defense had to be articulated in eloquent, grammatically perfect Latin. During a public disputation, for example, Julian might be challenged by a master. Quid dicis de universali ante rem? What do you say about the universal before the thing? He had to process the question, formulate a philosophical answer, and then articulate it precisely, all in Latin, without hesitation. A slip of the tongue, a grammatical error, or a poorly chosen verb tense could undermine his credibility, even if his underlying thought was sound. The pressure to speak and write Latin flawlessly was constant. Students were expected to debate complex, philosophical, theological, or legal points with speed and precision. They needed to know not just the vocabulary, but the intricate syntax, the rhetorical flourishes, and the specific technical terms of their chosen discipline. A legal student had to master the Latin of Roman law distinct from the Latin of theology or medicine. The ability to think on one's feet in Latin was vital. During oral examinations, a master might deliberately ask a question designed to confuse or trick the student, testing their ability to maintain composure and clarity of thought while navigating a foreign linguistic terrain. This was not a modern language class, where errors were tolerated. This was the academic lingua franca of Europe, and any perceived deficiency marked a student as unprepared or less capable. This constant linguistic pressure contributed significantly to the grueling nature of the examinations. It added an extra layer of difficulty to every intellectual task. Students had to not only master complex subjects, but also simultaneously perform the demanding cognitive task of operating entirely in a second language. The Latin labyrinth ensured that only those with exceptional linguistic discipline and intellectual agility could truly excel in the medieval university system. Number 5. The memory marathon, recalling volumes of knowledge on demand. In an age before widespread printing, when books were rare, expensive, and often chained to library shelves, memorization was not just a study technique. It was a fundamental pillar of medieval education and a brutal component of university examination. Students were expected to possess prodigious memories, capable of recalling vast quantities of text on demand. This was a true memory marathon, a continuous test of a student's ability to retain and instantly retrieve an enormous body of knowledge. Consider John, a student of theology at the University of Paris. His primary textbook was often the master's lecture, itself delivered orally and then diligently copied by students. John would spend hours, days, and weeks poring over his meticulously copied notes, along with the few precious copies of authoritative texts he could access. The goal was not just to understand the concepts, but to internalize the very words of the masters, the church fathers, and the scriptures. During examinations, John might be asked to quote specific passages from the Bible, from Peter Lombard's sentences, or from a particular commentary. A master might say, "Brother John, can you recite the passage from Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 8, concerning predestination?" John would have to recall the exact wording, verbatim. From memory, there was no flipping through pages, no quick search. His brain was the library. This extended beyond theology. A law student would be expected to quote specific sections of the Justinian Code or Gratian's Decretum. A medical student might need to recall detailed anatomical descriptions or pharmaceutical recipes from ancient Greek and Arabic texts, translated into Latin. It was a test of raw recall, pushing the limits of human memory. The pressure was immense. Forgetting a key phrase or misremembering a crucial word could be seen as a fundamental failure of understanding, or even worse, a sign of insufficient diligence. The silence in the examination room would be broken only by the student's voice, carefully articulating each word, or by the heavy silence if a passage eluded their grasp. The fear of a blank mind, of suddenly being unable to retrieve a vital piece of information after years of dedicated study, was a constant terror. Students developed elaborate mnemonic techniques, often involving memory palaces or intricate mental images, to aid their recall. They would walk through imaginary buildings, placing different parts of a text in different rooms, associating passages with specific objects. The sheer physical and mental endurance required to commit such vast quantities of material to memory, and then to be able to access it under the intense pressure of an examination, made the memory marathon one of the most grueling aspects of medieval academic life. It was a testament to a student's dedication, discipline, and raw intellectual power. Number 4. The scholastic debate, the questioner's crucible. Beyond the formal examinations, the scholastic debate, or quaestio disputata, was a cornerstone of medieval university life and a frequent, intense examination method. This was not just a friendly discussion. It was a highly structured, rigorous intellectual combat designed to test a student's logical reasoning, rhetorical skill, and mastery of a subject. It was a questioner's crucible where ideas were forged and tested under intense scrutiny. Imagine a large assembly hall, packed with students, bachelors, and masters. The center, a master would pose a question, a complex, often paradoxical or controversial proposition. For instance, does a particular virtue exist in angels? Or is it permissible to lie to save a life? The question would be deliberately designed to provoke deep intellectual exploration and reveal the subtleties of a topic. A student, perhaps a bright bachelor named Robert, would be assigned the task of presenting arguments for the question, and another student would present arguments against it. They would then take turns, citing authorities, using logical deductions, and attempting to dismantle their opponent's arguments. This was not about personal opinion. It was about logical consistency, citing respected authorities like Aristotle, the Bible, or established legal precedents, and using precise terminology. The masters presiding over the debate were not passive observers. They would actively intervene, posing new objections, challenging assumptions, and pushing the students to consider counter-arguments they had not anticipated. Brother Robert, a master might interject, "Your premise seems to contradict the teachings of Thomas Aquinas on that very point. How do you reconcile this?" Robert had to think quickly, recall specific theological arguments, and formulate a nuanced defense, all while maintaining perfect Latin. The debate could be fiercely competitive. Students sought not only to prove their own points, but also to expose the logical flaws in their opponent's reasoning. Pressure to outwit one's peers and impress the masters was immense. This was a public performance, and a poor showing could damage a student's reputation significantly. The audience, including other students, was also part of the arguative process, silently judging the intellectual prowess on display. Quaestio disputada trained students to think critically, to argue coherently, and to defend their positions under pressure, prepared them for the ultimate challenge of the licentiate and master's examinations, where they would have to defend their own theses against multiple masters. The scholastic debate was an intellectual proving ground, a relentless crucible that transformed students from mere learners into masters of reasoning and discourse. It ensured that only the sharpest and most logically sound minds could truly ascend to the highest echelons of medieval scholarship. Number 3. The Master's Gauntlet, the final trial of the licentiate. After years of relentless study, memorization, and countless disputations, the aspiring master faced the ultimate test. The licentiate examination, often known as the Master's Gauntlet. This was the final, most terrifying hurdle, the make-or-break moment that determined whether a student would be granted the permission to teach, the licentia docendi, and eventually wear the coveted master's cap. The setting for this examination was often grand and intimidating. It might take place in a prominent hall of the university, or even a cathedral, filled with an assembly of senior masters, university officials, and sometimes even visiting dignitaries. The student, let us call him Arthur, dressed in his modest student robes, stood before a panel of his future peers, the very masters who had taught him and who now held his fate in their hands. The examination was an intense oral interrogation. Arthur would have previously submitted a series of theses propositions he intended to defend. Now each master on the panel would take turns questioning him, probing his understanding, challenging his arguments, and searching for any weakness in his knowledge or logic. Master Stephen, known for his incisive questions, might lean forward, his gaze piercing. Brother Arthur, he might begin, you stated that faith precedes understanding. Defend this proposition against the arguments of those who prioritize reason. Arthur would have to respond immediately, drawing upon all his years of study, citing authorities, constructing logical arguments, and anticipating counter-objections. Questions could range across the entire breadth of his discipline: theology, law, medicine, or arts, touching upon obscure points, complex ethical dilemmas, or subtle philosophical distinctions. Another master might challenge his interpretation of a specific legal statute, demanding to know its historical origin and its practical application. This relentless questioning could last for hours, sometimes stretching for an entire day or even be broken into multiple sessions over several days. Arthur was not allowed to consult notes. His voice might grow hoarse, his mind weary, but he had to maintain his composure, articulate his thoughts clearly, and defend his positions with unwavering confidence. The masters were not trying to help him, they were trying to break him to ensure that only the most robust intellects passed through their ranks. The stakes were incredibly high. Failure meant that years of grueling effort, often supported by family sacrifice or a patron's generosity, would be for nothing. The student would not receive the coveted licentia docendi, effectively ending their academic career. The public nature of the examination, with potentially a small audience present, added another layer of pressure. The reputation of the university and indeed the entire scholastic tradition rested on the rigor of this final test. The master's gauntlet was designed to be an ordeal, a trial by fire, that confirmed not just a student's knowledge, but their intellectual fortitude and their worthiness to join the distinguished ranks of the masters. Number 2. The private disputation, an early brutal test of skill. Before students could even dream of the grand public showdowns, they faced an earlier, more intimate but no less brutal test. The private disputation, often called refunctions for Bachelor of Arts candidates. This was typically one of the first major academic examinations, designed to assess a student's fundamental grasp of logic and grammar after a few years of introductory studies. It was a crucial weeding out process, a test of a student's raw aptitude and their readiness for the more advanced rigors of university life. Imagine young George, a student barely out of his teens, nervous energy coursing through him. He stood in a smaller room, perhaps a master's study, or a quiet corner of a collegiate hall. Opposite him sat a single master, sometimes accompanied by a few senior students who acted as assistants or observers. The atmosphere, while less public than later examinations, was thick with tension. There was nowhere to hide, no large crowd to blend into. All the tension was focused solely on George. The master would present George with a basic, yet tricky, thesis or question related to logic, grammar, or rhetoric. For example, every man is an animal, every animal is rational, therefore every man is rational. George's task was to respond to this proposition. He had to affirm or deny it, and then defend his position using established rules of logic and sound reasoning. The master, however, was not there to make it easy. Their role was to deliberately try to trap George, to expose any flaws in his understanding or his argumentation. They would ask leading questions, introduce subtle fallacies, or demand clarification on what seemed like obvious points. Brother George, the master might challenge, if every man is an animal, and a donkey is an animal, does it follow that a man is a donkey? George had to quickly recognize the logical trick, understand the flawed syllogism, and explain why the conclusion was incorrect. All while remaining polite and respectful, the pressure to perform was immediate and intense. This was often the first formal examination where a student's academic future was directly on the line. Failing repunctions meant a significant setback, often requiring a student to repeat their studies or even abandon their pursuit of a degree altogether. The humiliation of failing this early test, especially in front of a master whose opinion carried so much weight, was a heavy burden. Private disputation honed a student's ability to think critically, to argue coherently, and to defend their ideas under direct interrogation. It instilled the discipline of precise language and logical rigor that was essential for all subsequent stages of medieval academic life. It was a brutal initiation, but one that ensured only those with a nascent intellectual capacity and unwavering dedication could proceed further into the challenging world of the medieval university. Number 1. The public disputation, the ultimate scholarly showdown. Public disputation, Particularly the Vespers disputation stood as the crowning, most terrifying examination in the medieval university system. It was not merely a test of knowledge, it was an ultimate scholarly showdown, a theatrical, intellectual, gladiatorial combat, where a student's entire academic career and often their reputation hung in the balance. Held in public, sometimes in a church or a large university hall, it was a grand spectacle designed to be both an examination and a demonstration of academic prowess. Consider a student, let us call him Peter, a Bachelor of Arts, who was preparing for his Vespers disputation at the University of Paris. This was typically the final major hurdle before he could be granted the licentia docendi, the license to teach. For weeks, Peter had meticulously crafted a series of theses, propositions on complex philosophical or theological topics that he intended to defend. These theses were posted publicly, inviting challenges. On the appointed evening, the hall would be packed. Not only masters and fellow bachelors were present, but also students, university officials, and sometimes even townspeople drawn by the intellectual spectacle. Peter would stand before this assembly, his theses laid out. A senior master, perhaps a figure of great renown, would preside. The air was thick with expectation. The master presiding would begin by reading one of Peter's theses, perhaps on the nature of universals or the relationship between faith and reason. Then the challengers would come forward. These were often other masters, highly experienced scholars, and sometimes even more senior bachelors, all eager to test Peter's intellect. They would launch objections, ask probing questions, and introduce counter-arguments, all delivered in fluent, sometimes biting Latin. Brother Peter, a challenging master might boom, "Your argument for the existence of universals seems to contradict the very principles of nominalism we have taught. How do you resolve this apparent inconsistency?" Peter had to immediately respond, drawing upon his vast knowledge, demonstrating logical consistency, and citing authoritative texts to support his position. He had to be quick-witted, articulate, and unwavering. The disputation could last for hours, sometimes extending well into the night. Peter would defend thesis after thesis, facing a barrage of objections, each designed to expose a flaw in his reasoning or a gap in his knowledge. He could not falter, could not appear confused, and certainly could not give up. Presiding master would sometimes throw in unexpected curveballs, introducing entirely new objections or demanding clarification on obscure points. Public nature meant that Peter's performance was judged by everyone present. A strong showing earned him immense respect and validated his years of study. Poor performance, however, could be a source of lasting humiliation, undermining his credibility and casting doubt on his suitability to become a master. Public disputation was more than just an exam. It was a ritual, a public affirmation of academic worthiness, and an ultimate scholarly showdown that cemented the reputations of both the individual and the university itself.